The truth is that I don't remember when I bought bullets per minute. What I can say is that knowing what tends to grab my attention when it comes to games, I'm sure that I was interested because of the fact that it was showcased as a fast-paced first-person shooter, and it probably helped that it was affordable. Either way, I might as well just jump into the bulk of my review for BPM. The last 10 to 15 years of mainstream FPS games have made it so that precise platforming in an FPS is surprising. It really shouldn't be, seeing as how games like Doom featured platforming back in the 90s, and there are 3D FPV games based around this idea, but it's still a surprise to me. It's because I expected BPM to be your typical meat and potatoes kind of shooter. What I mean is that if someone were to ask me to pick 3 words to describe the typical FPS game, I'd choose run and gun. There's definitely a lot of running and gunning in BPM, but there's also a lot of precise platforming that helps mix its gameplay up. Early on in the game, this was noticeable thanks to seeing out-of-reach areas that could only be gotten to with very precise maneuvering and understanding of the game's controls. You could say that the point of these was to let you know what could ultimately be accomplished with the game's simple controls. I'm pretty sure I've brought this up in the past, but it's something worth mentioning again. I love it when a game has simple controls and complex mechanics. It's because that makes it so that a game is easy to play, but difficult to master. One of the results of that is that your game is more accessible to a wider audience, which should hopefully lead to better sales, but at the end of the day, the more people that are playing your game, the better off you'll be. Seeing as how I really wasn't interested in mastering every single aspect of this game, sometimes I was able to quickly figure out what was required of me, but if I saw something that seemed too out of my league, I just stuck to the basics. Sometimes I couldn't ignore precise platforming moments, but I was fine with that. More specifically, this was during the lava levels. In a somewhat unrelated note, I was partially happy with the lava levels and its platforming because it reminded me of Kuwabara's fight with Byakuya, which took place in the classic and beloved anime Yu Yu Hakusho. I'm sure that the chances of these two separate things being related are slim, but since it reminded me of something that I really care about, that made things more enjoyable for me on a personal level. I'd like to say that you should strive to recreate moments such as this one in your own games, but the problem is that you really don't know what feelings or memories games will invoke in different people. What reminded me of an anime may remind someone else of a different game, or maybe even a movie. This really isn't something worth delving into, at least when it comes to BPM, but it's still worth being viewed as a cherry on top. Knowing what kind of game BPM is, I went in with some preconceived ideas of how it'd play, but I ended up being proven wrong by it. With the majority of roguelite or roguelike games, you tend to assume that items will disappear if you don't immediately pick or buy them. BPM surprised me due to the fact that unclaimed items would remain in a room even after leaving. It was unlike other similar games I've played because those would have made it so that backtracking wasn't possible. This being done in BPM made it so that you could go back to take care of unfinished business, or you could just switch up your build depending on what you were aiming for. This really isn't that big of a deal, but sometimes small details such as this one can change how a game is played. One thing's for sure, the rhythm-based nature of BPM was set in stone. Things would change up depending on which weapon you chose, and most likely if you were playing on a much harder difficulty setting, but since I didn't try out the latter, I can only describe what I experienced. I thought that it was hard managing dodging, shooting, and staying on beat. During some moments it was hard balancing so much at the same time, so I'd occasionally tap my foot to the beat of the song, but BPM being challenging is one of the reasons why it's the game that it is. I'll eventually get back to that. I've previously enjoyed rhythm-based games, but for the most part, they tend to automate one or more parts of the gameplay so that you could heavily focus on staying on the beat. Whether or not that's good or bad depends on your interest as a gamer, but with BPM, it was right to leave so much up to you. It initially seems like something that shouldn't make sense, mainly because thematically there's a bit of a clash between restricting gunplay in an FPS such as this one. I could see how the weapons firing could be automated, but then where would the focus of the rhythm-based gameplay be, especially in an FPS game? As I mentioned before, the last 10 to 15 years of mainstream FPS games have gotten me used to certain elements being in an FPS no matter what. I know that there are games out there that have you manually reloading your weapon instead of it being an automated action, but can you blame me for expecting that in BPM? I bring that up because I thought it was weird to have a 6-shooter where you had to insert every single bullet into the gun. It's not only because I thought that it'd eventually be a hassle to deal with during hectic fights, but also because in a game where you have out-of-this-world abilities, manually reloading each bullet felt off. Despite having had a difficult time with some aspects of the game, it wasn't out to get you. I enjoyed eventually discovering power-ups and buffs either as a result of having completed side challenges or buying them from the merchant that would occasionally show up. I eventually grew to appreciate having access to infinite ammo, but at first it took some getting used to. As I played on, I started to see just how much was available to make things more manageable for you. I had no idea when exploding skulls showed up or why, but they helped. The skulls and other power-ups slash buffs were especially helpful because BPM ended up being harder than I expected it to be. Even if I enjoy playing games on what's considered their normal difficulty setting, in BPM easy was normal, so I figured I might as well. I gave the more mid-tier difficulty setting a try, but after seeing that it was the kind of challenge I wasn't looking for, I decided to go with what felt correct. This being an FPS would lead you to believe that it's like any other FPS, but the truth is that there were small details that took some getting used to. I felt that I was getting the hang of it, but I had a feeling that it eventually threw me a curveball when I least expected it. Sometimes it was because of how the levels slash dungeons were generated, but other times it was because of the build I'd end up with. Sometimes a run was surprisingly easy to put together, and that led me to going the furthest I've ever gone, but other times my build wasn't well balanced. For example, during one run I was armed to the teeth, but I needed more health. At the time that I was dealing with this, it was hard, but looking back on that experience, I like how it forced me to decide between being offensive or defensive. I had the firepower slash abilities to take down enemies, but at the same time, one single mistake would make it so that I'd end up dying sooner rather than later. It wasn't just that my weirdly put together builds or lack of resources worked against me. Sometimes it was simply because BPM surprised me in ways I wasn't expecting. I was around 3 hours into the game and I didn't expect icy floors to be a thing. I realize that some of you may be thinking that 3 hours isn't enough time for someone to get a full glimpse of what a game has to offer. But when a game's average time to beat is 3.5 hours, you'd think you've seen it all by that point. If anything, this is really more about the game's playtime, but I was satisfied with what I got versus what I paid for BPM. Going back to discussing icy floors, they were a bit of a hassle to deal with not only because it made moving around difficult, but also because that ended up spilling over into more than one area of the game. It made it hard to properly shoot at enemies, sometimes I'd end up running into them, and in general, it left me thinking about what else I'd end up discovering the further I progressed into BPM. Early on in BPM, I discovered that shortcuts were a thing. I thought that was great, mainly because I figured it would allow me to skip out on difficult areas or end up in areas that were easier to work around, but that wasn't the case. The results of utilizing these shortcuts was that I ended up being underpowered for the areas I ended up at. It also didn't help that I quickly realized that areas weren't limited to one level. On the bright side, I thought it was nice that the levels kept changing. It was an interesting way of including Metroidvania-like design in a game that's completely different from what's found in games of that genre. Mixing genres up sometimes leads to exciting gameplay, such as what's found in BPM. It wasn't just because you could go back to areas when you were better equipped to handle them, but the more experience you gained with the game and its mechanics, the more you could alter things to your favor. That was mainly as a result of being able to find power-ups or weapons that you typically didn't find. Though it's true that the average playtime for BPM is 3.5 hours, a lot of thought went into its art/level design. I wouldn't go so far as to say that it was as visually appealing as Cuphead, but it still managed to do a good job with what it had to offer. I'm sure that there's a limit to what the levels have or don't have to offer, but based on what I saw, this is the kind of game that delivers more past the point of having beaten it. I'm not the kind of gamer that regularly replays new games, but seeing as how there are others out there that approach gaming in a different way than I do, it's worth mentioning that a game such as BPM can match up with many different kinds of playstyles and personalities. To be honest, I didn't think I'd end up reviewing BPM. It's because I initially thought of it as a game that is what it is. I realize that the point for me is to expand on things that others may or may not notice, but it's true that what you see is what you get. The point isn't to imply that BPM has little to offer or that it's not as well-rounded as other games out there, because that's not true. What I'm getting at is that sometimes games don't leave me with immediate thoughts that lead me to believe I can easily write about this game. Depending on the situation, that can either be good or bad. The fact that I review games should make it so that I'm capable of writing about any and all games, but sometimes I just don't have a lot to say. Rather than attempting to stretch out a few observations into thousands of words, I'm reminded of something someone once said to me. You don't have to review every game you play. Thankfully, at least from my point of view, that wasn't the case with BPM. It's a really replayable game, but having seen the credits roll, it was easy for me to move on to the next game. That might make it seem like I didn't enjoy it, but that's not true. I liked it a lot, which can be seen by what stood out to me, but also because beating it felt like an accomplishment. There are other well-known games out there that might up your street cred as a gamer due to their difficulty, but this isn't the kind of game that you can casually breeze through. The fact that I lowered the difficulty setting to something more manageable and yet still found it difficult goes to show the true nature of the game. I know that in the eyes of some that makes it seem as if I'm unskilled or something, but the fact that it's a roguelike game should let those that know understand that even when you're skilled in games such as this one, sometimes a bad run or build will make it so that the odds end up stacked against you. Before I keep babbling on, I'll just cut to the chase. BPM is a game worth playing. It offers a refreshing taste of a genre that's been milked dry for quite some time, so if you want something different out of an FPS game, give bullets per minute a try. If you enjoyed this content, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and share. Thank you very much for watching.